There was a time when the name Constantine Valdor was spoken in reverence by all who knew the gravity of what he was. He was not a warrior in the sense of the Legionis Astartes, nor was he a general in the fashion of the War Master or the Lord Commanders. He was something more elemental, closer to the Emperor's will than any other being in the galaxy. First among the 10,000, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, Valdor the Gilded. But gold casts shadows, and Valdor's was the longest of them all. Even before the thunder of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor walked among men, Valdor was there. His existence predates the foundation of the Imperium itself. He was forged in silence, shaped not in gene labs, but in sealed vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, alongside prototypes and secrets too monstrous to document. He was not born. He was designated. The first. For decades, Valdor served as the Emperor's silent blade. He executed his will with precision and finality, unburdened by doubt or ego. He walked with the Sigillite, debated with the Primarchs, and slew in the name of stability. When entire gene cults had to be erased from history, Valdor did not ask why. When rogue psychers attempted to reach into the Emperor's mind, it was Valdor who made their final moments a whisper lost in static. And yet, for all his loyalty, for all his closeness to the master of mankind, Valdor knew something no others dared admit. The Emperor lied. Not always, not maliciously, but inevitably. His vision was too vast, his burden too terrible. In that burden there was no room for truth, only necessity. Valdor saw it, slowly, over centuries, in the eyes of Malcador when he passed on sealed orders without explanation. In the Primarchs, each gifted with freedom, but bound to a destiny they never chose. In the way the Emperor spoke of unity while forging weapons like Angron. In the way he spoke of peace while designing the Custodes to kill without hesitation. The gilding began to flake. When the Great Crusade began in earnest, Valdor's presence faded from public record. He was not on the front lines like the Primarchs. He did not lead vast campaigns. Instead, he appeared in the shadows of turning points, quietly, efficiently. He stood behind Magnus the Red when the Thousand Suns were first sanctioned. He accompanied the Emperor into the webway and saw the truth of the old knight still lurking in that place beyond comprehension. He was there on Prospero, not during the raising, but before, delivering words to Magnus that none ever recorded. When Horus rebelled, Valdor's role became even less visible. He was present at the Saturnine Wall, defending the Eternity Gate. That much is recorded. He stood beside Dorn and Ralderon, flanked by a dwindling circle of the Custodes, who still remembered him as a brother and not just a relic. But he vanished during the final hours. Not in death, in departure. The accounts are fragmentary, contradictory. Some say he followed the Emperor into the Golden Throne Chamber and never left. Others claim he was last seen boarding a black-skinned gunship bound for Luna, bearing an artifact recovered from the webway breach. One report, redacted in a dozen layers of Ordo script, speaks of a custodian in yellow-trimmed robes, walking through the warp without protection, smiling. What is known is that Valdor disappeared, and the galaxy moved on without him. The 10,000 became the 1,000. The Imperium hardened. The age of apostasy rose and fell. Guilliman disappeared and returned. Magnus screamed across realities, but Valdor remained unspoken, until the masks began to appear. At first they were dismissed. Theater relics. Heretical totems, masked figures seen at the edges of battlefields, never fighting, only watching. But then came the Apollonius incident. A full choir of black ship psychers erupted into synchronized verse during warp transit, reciting lines from a script no one had written, always ending with the phrase, "He walks again. The gilded shadow has donned the mask." And then came the dreams. Astropaths dreamed of golden armor rotting into yellow silk, of a throne built from broken custodian helms, of a voice, not demonic, not mortal, saying, "The play was never yours." A harlequin mask, the veiled echo, claimed to have encountered a lost king deep in the webway. They said he wore a golden mask cracked by time, and his voice was the Emperor's, and also not. He spoke of memory as performance, of history as rehearsal. They fled. Half of them went mad. Then the Ordo Chronos began their forbidden simulations. They traced patterns through time, using old data fragments from the Unification era and custodian battle records. The timelines diverged not during the heresy, but after. And always, in simulations that ran past M32, a new figure emerged. Not as a conqueror, as a director. Events were no longer random. Worlds collapsed in symbolic arcs. Cultures were rewritten in tragedy. Every conflict took on the shape of an unfolding drama. Not chaos, not imperial control. Something else, something with intent. One name appeared again and again. Valdor. Only now he bore a new title, the King in Yellow. The theory was blasphemous, and yet it matched. The custodian known for silence, perfection, and obedience had vanished. A masked figure of identical genetic markers reappeared across history, always tied to manipulation, revision, and the restructuring of fate. Not to destroy, but to restitch. The truth, perhaps, is this. Constantine Valdor did not die. He changed roles. He saw the Emperor's final gambit, the webway, the throne, the lie of the imperial truth, and chose another path. He became the custodian not of flesh, but of narrative. And now the gilded shadow returns, no longer as a protector, but as the king. And the galaxy is his stage. It is said that only one being in the galaxy has ever been permitted to sit upon the golden throne while the Emperor still lived. That being was not a Primarch, not a High Lord, not Malkador the Sigillite, nor any other creature, mortal or otherwise. That being was Constantine Valdor, and even then it was not to rule. It was to understand. The records of this event are not merely sealed, they are unwritten, expunged from imperial data vaults by the Sigillite's own hand before the siege of Terra began. But fragments remain, whispered testimonies in the vaults of the Ordo Malleus, scrawled marginalia in forbidden editions of the Chronicle Divinus, the dying confession of a sister of silence who spoke only once in her life, and only to say he saw the throne's shadow. It changed him. The custodes had always been created not simply as guards, but as instruments of comprehension. Where the Astartes were legions of fury, the custodes were singular minds, able to witness, calculate, and interpret the Emperor's will without question. They were his law, made flesh. And Valdor was the first, the archetype. When the Emperor revealed the Webway project beneath the palace, when he began constructing the impossible gate between realms, it was Valdor who was brought deepest. He did not ask why the Emperor needed a new path to the stars. He asked what the cost would be, and he was shown. The throne, in its earliest form, was not a prison. It was a tool, capable of anchoring psychic currents, mapping the movements of immaterial tides. It allowed the Emperor to walk the skein of fate like a playwright studying the final act before the first word was spoken. It bent time. It burned out the minds of every psyker but him. But on one occasion he invited another. Valdor entered the throne chamber alone. Malkador did not accompany him. No other custodies were permitted within. Even Dawn, who had begun to oversee the palace's greater defenses, was not informed. The Emperor summoned only Valdor. He spoke no words. He gestured. Valdor approached. He took the seat. For 13 seconds, During those 13 seconds, the throne opened a window, not into the future, but into structure. Valdor did not see events. He saw the framework beneath them. Not a timeline, but a stage. Not actions, but roles. The siege, the heresy, the fall of the Primarchs, the failure of Guilliman, the red path of Magnus, the final breaking of the Legiones Astartes. All were threads, but they were not chosen. They were scripted. And at the center of that script was a throne. Not the golden throne, the nameless throne. He saw it behind every moment, in the warp, in the silence between decisions. A throne no one remembered building, a throne without occupant, without symbol, a throne that demanded to be filled. Valdor stood. He did not speak. He did not weep. But the Emperor saw the tremor in his stance. From that moment on, something shifted in him. He fought in the siege with fury. He struck down traitor Astartes with such efficiency that even Kharn reportedly turned from battle rather than face him in close combat. He walked the burning corridors of the Eternity Gate and stood unmoved even as the skies bled fire. But when the Emperor ascended to the throne for the final time, when Malkador was reduced to ash, when Terra mourned and screamed and bled, Valdor did not stay. He simply vanished. Some say he followed secret instructions, commands encoded by the Emperor into the throne itself. Others believe he fled, unable to bear the sight of what the Imperium had become. One theory, banned even in the darkest crypts of the Conclave, says that he saw the nameless throne in the warp and went to claim it. There is, however, one clue. A single data sigil buried in the encrypted command streams of the Mechanicum archives beneath Mars. Dated March 31st, 2014, 2 weeks after the siege ended. It reads, Subject, Valdor, Status, Active, Directive, Observe theater parameters, evaluate recursion in behavior patterns across loyalist and traitor frameworks, confirm presence of mask. That message was intercepted by a black ship passing through Martian orbit. The ship was destroyed 22 minutes later in what was labeled a reactor failure, but a cogitator core survived, recovered by a Magos who later claimed he was haunted by dreams of actors speaking in dead languages and a voice calling from the center of a shattered palace. The voice said, I never left the throne. I simply changed the stage. It was not a custodian's voice. It was theatrical, cold, deliberate, but familiar. Decades later, during the Age of Apostasy, a masked figure was seen entering the palace during the height of Goge Vandir's reign. No one could explain how he bypassed the Adeptus Custodes. No one could trace his origin. But he appeared in the audience chamber, walked calmly through the fracturing court, and handed the bride of the Emperor a single object, a yellow mask. Then he vanished. A sister of battle, present in the chamber, would later describe him not as a heretic or a specter, but as a golden figure cloaked in dust and silence. She would say, trembling, he was dressed like a custodian, but older, worn, like something that remembered glory, and she would never speak again. To this day, no custodian speaks of Valdor's disappearance, not because they do not remember, but because they do. They remember the throne before the fire. They remember the 13 seconds. They remember the shadow that followed him afterward. And they know what waits. Because when a king steps away from the throne, he does not retire. He waits in the wings. And someday, when the galaxy forgets its lines and the performance falters, the curtain will rise again, and Constantine Valdor will return. Not as a guardian, not as a relic, but as the king. The nameless throne will no longer be empty, and the audience will be seated. There are some wounds too deep for even a demigod to carry. The siege of Terra left a scar across the galaxy, but deeper still was the silence it left behind. The Primarchs fled, the traitors dispersed into the eye, and the Emperor ascended the throne to sit in silence for eternity. But of all the disappearances in those blackened hours, one was more quiet, more precise, and more terrifying than the rest. Constantine Valdor walked away. No ceremony, no farewell, no body, no marker. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, the first of the 10,000, the Emperor's shadow and will, gone. Dorn asked after him only once, during the reconstruction of the Sanctum Imperialis. The reply he received from the remaining custodians was as direct as it was damning. He was not one of us anymore. What could sever a custodian from his purpose? Their bond to the Emperor was not just loyalty, it was being. Their minds were shaped by his psychic presence, their blood bound to the purpose of defending him and him alone. For a custodian to abandon his post was not disobedience, it was ontological collapse. And yet Valdor did. The truth, of course, had already begun unraveling long before the final gunshot of the siege. He had been the Emperor's right hand for over 2 centuries before the Primarchs were even found. He watched the master of mankind create godlike sons, only to discard or chain them when they stepped out of line. He watched Malcador wield authority like a weapon while hiding entire libraries of forbidden prophecy. He obeyed as psychers were burned and silenced, even as the Emperor prepared to power the Golden Throne with thousands of them. He knew the paradox. He understood that truth in the Imperium had always been a costume, that purpose was a performance, but understanding does not make enduring possible. In the final days of the heresy, Valdor became isolated, not out of malice but detachment. He spoke less. He walked alone through the burned halls of the inner palace, pausing often in the Chapel of Ashes, an empty shrine with no altar, no symbols. When he was seen, it was often not in war council or combat, but in the presence of dead actors, slain remembrancers, unburied scribes, forgotten medicae, men and women who had played their part in the tragedy of the heresy and been discarded from the page. Some say Valdor began speaking to them, not in madness, in rehearsal. There are accounts, buried deep in the Librarius Omega, of a custodian detachment assigned to watch Voldor after the siege. These were not novices. They were his peers, elite warriors who had stood at the edge of the webway breach and returned alive. But even they feared what they saw. They described Voldor as changing, not visibly, not physically, but his presence warped the air. He would quote lines that no one had spoken, anticipate conversations before they began. He began referring to events in the past as if they had yet to happen, and events in the future as if they were already concluded. When asked how he knew, he responded with one word: blocking, a theatrical term, the placement of an actor upon a stage. He told one custodian that Malcador had not died, but had exited stage left. He told another that the Emperor's silence was not death, but a directional choice. He stopped referring to the galaxy as a battlefield. He called it a script. And then he left. The exact moment is unknown. The palace's inner wards detected no breach, no psychic tremor, no displacement. The custodians watching him simply blinked, and he was no longer there. His armor remained, folded neatly on a stone bench. His guardian spear was gone. In its place was a mask, not custodian, not theater, something in between. Yellow, lined in gold, featureless save for a faint curve of a smile. The remaining custodians attempted to retrieve the mask. They failed, not because it resisted, but because they each forgot why they were reaching for it. Each time one tried to pick it up, they found themselves standing several paces away, staring at their hand with confusion. Some described the sensation of having just delivered a monologue. Others tasted ink on their tongue. One sang a lullaby in a language never spoken. The mask was sealed beneath 20 layers of hexagrammic wards and stored in Vault Praxis, which was then collapsed into a null space pocket to prevent interference. It still appears in the dreams of those who had touched it. And always, in those dreams, a single line is spoken. He has walked off the stage. But the play continues. Centuries passed. The Adeptus Custodes remained on Terra, inwardly reeling, outwardly unshaken. They spoke not of Valdor. To them he was a memory disallowed, but others remembered. The Eldar called him the Golden Spectre. The Harlequins of the Mask of the Shattered Mirror performed an unsanctioned piece titled The Gilded Betrayal, in which a golden figure lays down his blade and dons a mask before rewriting the fate of the galaxy with a quill of light. The Mechanicus unearthed relics during the excavation of Luna's sub-vaults, fragments of Valdor's genetic signature etched into machinery older than the Unification Wars. In the circuitry was embedded the phrase, "He refused the lines he was given." And then came the evidence. Sightings. In the ashes of the 8th Black Crusade, a warband of the Red Corsairs reported a lone warrior, garbed in flowing yellow robes, wearing a golden mask, walking through the ruin of a shrine world. He left no footprints. His weapon, a curved glaive of antique design, was never drawn. The bodies of the dead were found posed, seated, hands folded, as if they had just witnessed a play. On Gulmark Beta, an inquisitorial executioner who once served under Valdor, claimed to have spoken with a man in a golden mask who knew the name of every soldier he had ever killed. The man offered him a script. The Inquisitor declined. He was found dead 43 minutes later, smiling, and so the galaxy whispers. Valdor did not fail. He chose. He stepped off the path, walked out of the palace, shed the gold, and became something else, something watching, waiting, not to return as a warrior, but as the king. And when he does, it will not be to fight. It will be to raise the curtain. The Eternity Gate is not a door. It is not merely a bastion, a barrier, or a bulwark. It is a monument to finality, the last threshold between the Emperor's silence and the galaxy's eternal howl. It has stood since the earliest days of the heresy, fashioned from adamantine and ancient pacts, sealed with wards drawn in language older than Terra. Beneath its shadow, thousands have died, billions have prayed. Few have truly seen it. Fewer still have entered. But there is a room behind it, forgotten even by the custodies who pace its outer corridor with unblinking vigil. A vestibule, sealed beneath 5 layers of anti-psyker shielding, hidden behind ceremonial walls, etched with pictograms so ancient that even the Mechanicus refuses to translate them. They call it the Chamber of Echoes. No custodian speaks of it now. The name has vanished from all litanies, all schematics, all breath. But its existence lingers in the footnotes of the pre-heresy regimental blueprints. A meditation chamber originally designed for custodians to sit in stillness, to reflect before guarding the throne room directly. Now it is empty. Except for the masks, 16 of them. Each rests on its own pedestal. Each is carved from different materials, some bone, some polished gold, some black iron. All are shaped into faces. All wear expressions. Some weep, some grin. One, the oldest, is entirely blank, and above them all, carved into the domed ceiling in sigils only visible at oblique angles, a sentence is repeated over and over. The king rehearses in silence. This room is not open, not patrolled, not monitored, yet it is always clean. No dust gathers, no decay. Even the automated sweeping servitors programmed to clean the corridors outside do not pass its entrance, not because they are told not to, but because they forget it exists. The Chamber of Echoes is where Valdor left his masks, not metaphors, real ones. In the years before he vanished, he came here often, more and more as the siege dragged on. Records show he visited alone. Each time he stayed precisely 1 hour, and each time, upon leaving, a new mask would appear on a pedestal. They are not identical, but all of them resonate with residual psychic charge. The Ordo Psychina once attempted to classify them. Only 3 acolytes returned from the initial contact test. One described feeling as if a performance had been implanted in his mind. Roles, settings, audience cues. Another said she saw herself delivering orders to armies she had never commanded, only for her soldiers to dissolve into applause. The third simply laughed, endlessly, for 9 days, until his lungs collapsed. That was the end of the investigation. The masks remained untouched, until the 13th Black Crusade. The forces of Abaddon had reached the Segmentum Solar's outer rim. Terra braced for the unthinkable. The Adeptus Custodes, for the first time in millennia, began full war-footing deployment outside of the palace. All custodians were summoned, all but one. The custodian, known as Thalius Dornacht, was tasked with remaining behind, guarding the Eternity Gate itself. He did not question the order, he did not protest, but before he took post he wandered, seeking answers to a question he would not articulate. He found the chamber. No one could explain how. The schematics had been wiped clean, the permissions encoded into his war plate denied access to anything beyond the gate's inner perimeter. But Dornacht walked through its threshold as if he had always known the path. He stood before the masks for 9 minutes. Then he selected one. It was shaped like a sorrowful child, mouth open in silent scream. He placed it upon his face, and then he understood. Not a vision, not madness, a script. Words flooded him, not history, dialogue. He saw Valdor's descent into the webway, not as a memory but as a monologue. He felt the sting of Malcador's doubt, heard the Emperor's voice giving not orders but stage direction. He realized something horrific. The galaxy was not simply broken. It was written that way. Each war, each betrayal, each redemption arc and tragedy performed again and again across millennia. And Valdor had not fled. He had seen the script, and walked behind it. Dornacht tore the mask from his face and screamed. His brothers found him outside the chamber hours later, bleeding from the eyes, whispering in blank verse. He had carved a message into his flesh, using a shard of his own armor. The gate guards nothing. The king has already passed. He was executed shortly thereafter, his body burned and scattered into the void under the orders of the Captain General. No memorial was erected, but the Chamber of Echoes was sealed again, this time by the custodians themselves. No data records, no Vox mentions, only silence. But the masks are still there, and sometimes only when the gate is quiet, when the wars of the galaxy grow distant, and the weight of 10,000 years presses against the bones of the palace, you can hear something in that chamber. Not speech, not breathing, rehearsing, software-controlled, as if someone behind the wall is preparing for a performance. And though the masks never move, never shift, some swear that one, just one, is newer. Not left by Valdor, but worn recently. Its stand is labeled not with a name, but with a role. The king returned for Act 2, and that is the great terror of the chamber. Not that it holds relics, but that it holds a seat, waiting, not for a warrior, not for a god, but for the actor to return, and for the audience, us, to fall silent once more. No custodian speaks lightly of the moment they were forged. To be among the 10,000 is not to be merely born or trained. It is to be shaped into purpose itself. Each one stands as the Emperor's reflection, honed to mirror his intent with absolute precision. Yet there was one who mirrored him too closely, one who was made first, not as a reflection, but as a contingency. Constantine Valdor was not just the captain general, he was the first command. The earliest archives of the Unification Wars mention him only sparingly, as if even his presence on Terra was too sensitive to chronicle in full. But in the most sacred data vaults, those buried beneath the Imperial Palace in subrealms the Mechanicus refused to acknowledge, there exists a codex fragment labeled Directive Alpha Null. It contains a single line verified by the Lex Mechanics of 3 Forge Worlds to be in the Emperor's own hand. When the last deception is required, send him. Historians have long debated the meaning of this line. Was it a call to violence, a final mission, or something far more insidious? The last custodian to question the record, Shield Commander Erastus Von, vanished 2 hours after citing the directive aloud during a closed vault audit. His power armor was found neatly folded in the meditation chamber adjacent to the Hall of Silence. In its place, a mask, yellow, thin, smiling. The truth behind that command lies buried not in the stars, but in the time before the Great Crusade, when the Emperor still walked among men, and the future had not yet been dressed in gold and blood. Valdor was his first creation capable of knowing him, not merely obeying, knowing. He was given no illusions. Where the Primarchs were built to rule or to rage, Valdor was built to witness. His neural architecture was interlaced with counter-psionic filaments, designed not only to shield against the warp, but to resist the Emperor's own aura, so that when the moment came, Valdor could be told the truth, and survive it. It is said that, in the final weeks before Horus made his move, the Emperor summoned Valdor to the Sanctum Penumbra, a chamber used only for the gravest of matters. No records exist of what passed between them, but the echoes remain. A psychic resonance was detected across Terra's astropathic network, faint, sharp, slicing through the usual chorus like a stage direction called From the Wings. 3 words repeated endlessly for 7 seconds. Exit, stage right, and then nothing. Valdor left the chamber, wordless. He was never seen entering combat again. In the final stages of the siege, when the traitor legions broke through the Lion's Gate and madness clawed at the walls of Terra, Valdor did not lead the counter-offensives. He was not among the defenders at the Eternity Gate. While Dorn, Sanguinius, and Malcador bled to hold the palace together, Valdor vanished. Some said he died protecting the Emperor inside the throne room. Others whispered that he had ascended, taken into the Imperium by some unknowable force. The truth, however, is buried in one location, and one alone. The core spindle beneath the golden throne. Few know it exists. Fewer still have entered. An ossified pillar of super-reality suspended between Terra and the folds of unreality, where the Emperor's mind once cast anchors into the material universe. Before the throne became a tomb, it was a conductor's podium. There he orchestrated fate itself. Valdor was brought there one last time. He was shown the script. Not prophecy, choreography. Events unfurled in motions, wars as arcs, characters as symbols. The heresy was only the second act. The age of apostasy, the interregna, the coming of the rift, staged tragedy, not to deceive, but to delay, to give time for one last performance. The Emperor's final command to Valdor was not to fight. It was to rewrite, not the past, the end, and for that he would need to vanish. Not in defeat, nor death, but in silence. He would become a presence that watched the stars from the wings of reality. A director, not of people, but of their illusions. This is the true meaning behind the whispers of the king in yellow. He is not the god behind the mask. He is the mask behind every god. The final custodian of the Emperor's vision, but no longer bound by loyalty. Not because he betrayed him, but because he asked him to to change roles, to step into fiction. The mask was forged that very day, not from iron, not from gold, but from narrative, bound in psychic ink, laced with strands of forgotten names and splinters of discarded timelines. When Valdor donned it, he ceased to be custodian. His armor sloughed away, his voice altered, his silence became command. He became the king. He became the Emperor's final command. This is why he appears in no records. This is why his presence infects events, alters outcomes, distorts perception, not through the warp, but through the lens. You do not see the king in yellow because he walks where stories bend. He stands in the background of martyrdoms, in the second row of executions. He is the extra at every coronation, the masked witness in the last dreams of dying primarchs. And when he speaks, it is always in script. He once appeared before a dying Farseer during the fall of Biel-Tan. The Farseer saw him not as a man, but as a figure made of theatrical lighting and poetry. She asked him if he was death. He replied, "No, I am the Q before the end." Then he bowed, and she died. This is the legacy of Constantine Valdor, not a relic, not a martyr, not a forgotten warrior, but the Emperor's final weapon, not a blade, not a shield, a script, and the last line still unwritten, because the stage has not yet gone dark. The audience still waits, and the king has not yet delivered the final soliloquy. But when he does, the Emperor will not rise, the Imperium will not burn, the curtain will fall, and the performance, the illusion of order, of chaos, of meaning, will end, as was commanded. Before there was silence, there was dissonance. The siege of Terra fractured more than walls and warriors. It split the triumvirate upon which the Imperium had been built. The Emperor, the Sigillite, and the Captain General. The Creator, the Steward, and the Blade. For centuries they had moved as one, each filling the other's gaps, each understanding their role in the great work. But all plays must reach their turning point, and it was Malcador who saw the change first. The final years of the Great Crusade had worn them thin. The Sigillite's hands had blackened from years of arcane labor and psychic burdens too vast for any mortal, yet he carried them without faltering. He did what none of the Primarchs could do. He understood the Emperor's purpose. Not perfectly, but closely. He was not custodian, but confidant. Not warrior, but conscience. He had been allowed to ask questions that even the Adeptus Custodes would never voice, until Valdor did. It began quietly. Not with anger or rebellion, but with questions, observations, patterns. Valdor, by his very nature, was built to observe, to calculate every deviation. He saw the Emperor changing, no longer the warlord of unification, nor the philosopher-king who envisioned unity. He had become withdrawn, obsessed with the Webway project, willing to silence entire worlds for the sake of his great plan. Valdor brought this to Malcador, not with accusation but concern, and Malcador dismissed him, not cruelly, not harshly, but with the weary voice of a man who knew he was already losing. The Emperor bears the burden of all futures, Malcador had said, poring over the strands of fate like a playwright trimming a script. It is not for us to edit his lines. But Valdor had seen something in the warp, not demons, not chaos, structure. He did not say it aloud, but he had begun to suspect the Emperor's plan was not a command of the future, but a performance of it, a repetition, a divine rehearsal, and worse still that someone else, something else, had started rewriting the scenes. Malcador refused to believe it. He thought Valdor was fraying, perhaps even succumbing to psychic degradation, despite the Captain General being one of the most resistant minds in the Imperium. He summoned the Custodes Council. He tried to have Valdor removed from proximity to the Emperor. The Custodes refused. Valdor was the first, But something had shifted. Malcador's distrust was quiet but precise. He began carving out compartments of imperial governance that operated without custodian oversight. He began hiding things, artifacts, tomes, names. Entire vaults of knowledge began to disappear, their contents erased or displaced. And Valdor noticed. The breaking point came not in the throne room, nor the war councils, but in the ossuary vault of Segmentum 17 Theta, a place no man outside the Triumvirate had ever entered. A place where the Emperor's earliest experiments were sealed away, concepts older than Thunder Warriors, older than Astartes, older even than the Gene Seed. Valdor found Malcador there. The Sigillite had opened one of the crypts, not with keys, but with words, the kind that reshape reality. He stood before a mirrored stele, its surface whispering. Valdor did not recognize the reflection staring back at him. The Sigillite turned and said, "There are lines we must speak aloud, even if we do not believe them." Valdor said nothing. He stepped forward. Malcador tried to stop him, not with force, but with truth. He spoke of the future. He described the scouring, the madness that would follow, the fall of the Primarchs, the burning of churches in the name of false peace, and then the rising of churches in the name of false gods. He spoke of the stagnation, the decay, the slow death of reason. "You think I trust the Emperor more than you," Malcador said, "but I don't. I trust that we must lie to survive him." Valdor answered with a question. "Who gave you that line?" Malcador hesitated, and in that silence everything changed. Valdor reached into the mirrored stele and pulled free an object never named in any archive. A quill, forged from bone, laced with silver veins, not meant for writing but for rewriting. And Malcador recoiled. He knew what it was. "You're not supposed to know that exists." "I was never supposed to forget." The Emperor had shown Valdor things he had shown no one else, a contingency beyond contingencies, a moment where even the Sigillite would become misaligned. Valdor did not raise his blade. He placed the quill back into the vault, resealed the crypt, and turned to leave. Malcador tried to follow, but the custodian raised one hand, palm out, not as a threat, but as a ward. A moment passed, then Malcador was gone, not destroyed, not killed, banished. His body would later be found in the webway, seated on a throne of ash, his mind shattered. The official story, he had sacrificed himself to save the Emperor. That was not false, it was not true either. It was a conclusion, written after the fact. By Valdor. No one questioned it. No one investigated, and those who wondered soon forgot they were wondering at all. Because a new actor had taken the stage, not in golden armor, in silence. Valdor never returned to the throne room. He never spoke to the High Lords. He passed his authority to others and walked into the lower vaults of the palace. One day his armor was found empty. A yellow mask sat on the bench where it had rested. It bore no name, only a single inscription carved into the inner surface in a hand identical to Malcador's. "When truth fails, the mask delivers the line." That is how Valdor ensured the Emperor's final deception would succeed, not by protecting his body, but by protecting the illusion. Malcador had been necessary for a time, but he was a speaker of lines written by others. Valdor had become something more, the writer, the director, the king, and the galaxy would follow the script, whether it knew it or not. The Dome of the Watchers is the most sacred place in the Imperial Palace that does not appear on any map. It sits behind the throne, but above it, nestled between spires of logic-defiant wraithbone and stone that has never aged. It has no guards. It does not need them. Those who do not know it exists cannot find it. Those who do remember it rarely speak of it again, and yet it has always been there. High above the golden throne, above the crypt laboratories of the Mechanicus, and the war crypts of the Custodes, the dome rests in eternal silence. No light ever reaches it, not candle, not sun, not lumen, only memory. It was once a chamber of reflection, designed at the dawn of the Imperium for a single purpose: to listen, not for external threats, not for the warp, but for a change in the Emperor himself. During the height of the Unification Wars, the Emperor's mind extended across the planet. He could read the thoughts of kings and assassins. He could pluck dreams from orbit and extinguish uprisings before their conspirators had spoken aloud. His psychic resonance filled Terra like an ocean of gold. The dome was created to detect its absence. And in M31.017, something changed. The Watchers, hand-picked psychers bound to silence by oath and surgery, recorded a moment of stillness. Not absence, not death, just pause, as if the Emperor had turned away. Not from duty, but from the role he was playing. It lasted exactly 3.2 seconds, and when the signal returned, it was different, less directed, more performative. As if he had become aware that he was being watched. Only one being was summoned to the dome after that moment. Valdor. The custodian entered without a word, leaving his weapon at the threshold. The Watchers fell into trance the moment he passed the inner ring. Their minds, already seared from years of filtering divinity, simply stopped, and Valdor stood alone beneath the vault. He did not speak. He did not kneel. He stood as still as the 10,000-year statues carved into the walls around him, custodians of the past who had died before the Imperium had even begun. Warriors forged and perfected and discarded, just like him. And there, he waited. He waited for the Emperor to speak. He did not. Instead, the light changed. There are no visible fixtures in the dome, no sun, no lumen. And yet, light comes when it is needed, but on that day it turned amber, not bright, not dim, just sick, like gold allowed to rot. Valdor looked up, and for the first time since his forging, he felt observed. Not by the Emperor, by the throne. He had seen its plans before, its inner workings. He knew its function and its agony. But this was different. The throne was not a machine that day. It was a witness, and it was waiting. Valdor spoke, not aloud, not psychically, but inwardly, projecting himself into the data echoes that resided within the chamber, casting his thoughts like a monologue across the stone. I am Constantine Valdor, first among the Custodes, final blade of the Unification. I do not kneel, I do not beg. I await orders. Silence. Then from above, a sound not heard since the earliest days of Terra. Applause just once. 3 claps, slow, measured, final. And then a voice, his own. Are you ready for your next role? He turned. There was no one. Only a mask resting on the pedestal where once sat a chronomat that measured the Emperor's heartbeat. A mask he had never seen, but knew. Amber gold, lined with subtle script, blank of expression. He did not touch it. He looked at it, and in that instant he remembered. He remembered lives he had never lived, battles he had never fought, dialogues he had never spoken, but which echoed in his bones. He saw the heresy again, not as it was, but as it had been rehearsed. Horus raising his blade, Sanguinius breaking, Guillimain grieving, Fulgrim smiling. He remembered scenes, he remembered stage directions, and then the truth crushed him. They were not soldiers, they were characters, even the Emperor, especially the Emperor. The great lie of the Imperium was not faith, it was authorship. Someone, something had written it all, and it had handed him the pen. Valdor did not scream, he did not break. He bowed, not in submission, in acceptance. The mask did not move, it did not hover, it simply was. And Valdor knew, as he stepped back from it, that he had already put it on. Not in flesh, in soul. He left the dome with no words. The Watchers never awoke. Their bodies remained seated, their faces stretched in serene smiles, as if they had witnessed the ending before it arrived. To this day, the dome remains undisturbed. It is no longer sealed by locks or sigils. It is sealed by forgetting. No one remembers how to reach it. Even the custodians, perfect in mind and memory, feel only a vague discomfort when walking beneath the corridor that once led there, as if something beneath their armor shifts. And deep in the chamber, the mask still waits, but not for a face, for a cue. And somewhere in the palace, beneath stone that has never aged, Constantine Valdor watches from behind the silence. He does not lead, he does not guard, he listens. Because now the audience is seated, the lines are memorized, and the king waits behind the curtain. The siege of Terra is remembered in fire and blood, in broken walls and broken suns. It was the day the sky split and traitors fell from the heavens like ash. It was the moment when brother killed brother before the eyes of the master of mankind. But beneath the screams and thunder, in the shadows between the frames of history, something else moved, something unseen, something already written. The official records speak of Rogel Dorn commanding the defense of the Imperial Palace, of the 9th Legion holding the Eternity Gate, of Valdor leading the 10,000 in counter-operations through the Webway Breach. And yet, after the siege, many of the custodies who were confirmed alive during the final hours were never accounted for again. And Valdor vanished. But there is a single fragment, recovered from a broken autoscribe buried beneath what remained of the Sanctum Ecliptica, that tells a different story. The fragment was never meant to be read. It is written in high nomenclature, encoded in a cipher designed to only be recognized by a custodian. The translation reads, "He watched the siege unfold as one watches a tragedy long rehearsed." And then a line almost dismissive. The script did not deviate. What this suggests, and what no one dares say aloud, is that Constantine Valdor did not vanish during the siege. He withdrew. From command, from loyalty, from reality. As Horus's forces breached the outer walls, as traitors stormed through halls built to house gods, Valdor moved with quiet purpose, not to defend, not to kill, but to observe. He walked the blood-slick corridors of the palace, not in golden armor, but in robes of dusk yellow, not ceramite, but cloth. No helm, no insignia, just the mask, smooth, unbroken, without eye slits or mouth. Witnesses reported him, but only in retrospect. Legends dismissed as battlefield trauma spoke of a figure in yellow robes moving untouched through areas flooded with enemy forces. A word-bearer war priest swore he saw a tall, silent man in a golden mask standing behind the War Master's command line just before the bombardment of the inner basilica. He described the figure raising one hand and nodding as if granting permission. That priest died mid-sentence, his tongue twisting into a language no one present recognized. Elsewhere, on the upper battlements, a Death Guard detachment advanced through the broken spires of the Conservator's tower. Vox records captured the squad leader halting without reason, raising his plague sword, and then turning it on his own squad. One word was spoken. Q. His helmet melted from the inside. Even Malcador, who in those final hours was still the fulcrum of the Emperor's plan, was seen whispering to a man who was never identified, a tall figure in yellow. No name, no retinue, no insignia. They spoke for 7 minutes behind a curtain of silence no psyker could penetrate. When Malcador returned, he was weeping. He sealed the throne room shortly after. So, who was this figure? The Ordo Chronos has compiled evidence from more than 50 battlefields across the siege. Each data point is the same. A masked figure, always in yellow or amber, always present when decisions are made, moments of fate balanced between catastrophe and salvation. Not once does he interfere. He appears and watches, as if ensuring each beat of the battle plays out according to design, as if directing. This is what they fear, that Constantine Valdor was never trying to prevent the heresy, that he was never trying to win the siege, that he was ensuring the story unfolded. And when the final curtain neared, when the Emperor stepped forward to confront Horus, when the fate of the galaxy narrowed to a point so sharp it could split reality, it is said Valdor was already waiting. Not beside the Emperor, beside Horus. There is no official record of this, but one traitor, a former Luna Wolf named Harren Sevrak, confessed during a Black Library interrogation to seeing a masked figure standing in the shadows of the Vengeful Spirit's war room before the final confrontation. "I thought he was one of ours," Sevrak whispered. "He watched Horus as if he knew every move my War Master was about to make, like he'd seen it played 1,000 times." "What did he do?" the Inquisitor asked. "Nothing," Sevrak replied. "He just clapped." That transcript ends with Sevrak vomiting blood and choking on a shredded fragment of parchment that had somehow lodged itself in his throat. The only legible line on it read, Act 3, The Emperor's Fall. We tell ourselves the siege of Terra was chaos, betrayal, fire, the pinnacle of human failure and desperation. But what if it was orchestration? What if Valdor, knowing what the Emperor had seen, what he had intended, chose not to stand in defense of his throne, but to stage its loss? The heresy did not fail. It landed. Every death, every brotherhood shattered, every soul offered in sacrifice, all part of the performance. And the king in yellow, the custodian who walked away, was there to make sure the timing held. In the final moments of the siege, as Sanguinius fell, as the Emperor was broken, as dawn screamed behind locked doors, a figure in yellow stepped into the ruins of the Eternity Gate. No one saw him enter, but every surviving custodian present at the scene reported the same vision as they pulled the Emperor's shattered body from the field. A man in robes of pale gold, standing in the center of the debris, not weeping, not speaking, just watching, and in his hand, a mask. Their reports were stricken from the archives, their minds purified. But one phrase remained written on a stone slab in the Chamber of Silence, in a hand none have replicated. The first act is complete. No signature, just a stage direction. Exit Valdor. The siege of Terra did not mark the end of Valdor's duty. It marked the beginning of his performance. And we, the Imperium, are still applauding. The Saturnine Gate was never supposed to fall. Of the 4 great gates that ringed the Imperial Palace during the siege of Terra, Saturnine was the most heavily fortified, an engineering marvel of black stone lattice, gravitic fields, and anti-tank bastions layered in overlapping kill zones. The Blood Angel said its defenses were so dense that even Guilliman could not have diagrammed a breach. Dorn himself had once declared, "If Saturnine breaks, Terra breaks with it." But it did break. And what broke it wasn't treachery or demonic fury or the cleverness of the War Master's strategists. It was absence. Valdor was supposed to be there. The Saturnine Wall was under his personal jurisdiction, guarded by the Athanatoi Guard, custodians who had served since the days before the Primarchs were rediscovered. They were the Watchers of Saturnine, chosen by Valdor himself, drilled in warfare not of brute force but of precision timing, timing that never failed. Until one night it did. The night the wall fell, the Athanatoi vanished. No signs of combat, no bodies, no final transmissions. They were there, then they were not. What happened next was recorded by the surviving remnants of the Raven Guard auxiliary scouts stationed 2 levels below the Saturnine Keep. These survivors, most of whom would later be executed by the Inquisition for contaminated memory strands, told the same impossible tale. They said a door opened in the wall, a door, not blasted, not warped, not breached. It opened, like a stage entrance, and from the blackness beyond walked not traitors, not diamonds, not siege engines, but a single figure, robed, tall, unarmed, wearing a mask the color of faded sunlight. The traitor forces stood behind him, frozen. They did not charge, they did not scream. They waited, and the figure raised one hand, not to command, but to begin. The wall unfolded, steel bent in symmetrical layers as if peeled back by invisible stage hands. Pillboxes twisted open like theater curtains. The gravitic fields dropped not with failure, but with a sigh like applause withheld too long. Every defensive layer deactivated itself in sequence, not at random, with choreography. The gate collapsed in silence, and the enemy advanced. But only once the figure had exited. He did not look back. He did not join them. He simply vanished. When Rogel Dawn arrived hours later, flanked by what remained of his Templar Guard, he demanded to know who had ordered the recall of Valdor's custodians. The reply came from Captain Commander Savrex Hal, who had not spoken since the death of the Emperor's dogmata during the Third Battle of the Petitioner's City. His words were simple. Valdor gave no order. He walked the wall alone, and then he walked away. This was impossible. No custodian breaks rank, no custodian deserts, especially not Valdor. But as the data was reviewed, it became evident that no security imprint remained, no biosign, no psychic trace. His armor's transponder, bound to the heart of his warplate, had not been deactivated. It had been rewritten. In its place was a single phrase encoded into the palace network at a level only the Emperor himself could override. Stage reset acknowledged. Exit confirmed. That same phrase appeared hours later in the Vox recordings of the Legio Custodes command center. It was never spoken aloud. It was simply there, recorded as background hum beneath the binary static of the custodian's strategium logs. The tech priest assigned to audit the logs wept oil for 6 days before severing his own data thread and leaving only this message etched into his cogitator's casing. He was not escaping. He was turning the page. The Imperium never admitted to the loss. The records of Saturnine's failure were repainted, rewritten, cast in the language of noble sacrifice. The Athenatoi were posthumously commended, their names etched into the sable obelisk. A statue of Valdor was raised atop the broken wall, showing him casting his spear in defense of Terra. But the Custodes do not remember it that way. They do not visit the statue. They do not speak of Saturnine, not because of shame, because of memory, because some of them still see it, in their dreams, that door in the wall, opening not with violence but with invitation, because what they saw at Saturnine wasn't treachery, it was performance, a scene played precisely as written, and Valdor, he wasn't running, he wasn't lost, he was leaving the set. One report, heavily redacted, found centuries later in a scrap code file hidden beneath the Martian databanks of the Fabricator General, suggested that the Saturnine incident was not an isolated moment. It was Act 2, the second proof of what Valdor had become, a manipulator of battles not through force, but through structure, a director in yellow robes, one who knew the siege was not to be won, only concluded. And with Saturnine fallen, with the breach opened, the great finale could begin. Not the death of the Emperor, not the fall of Sanguinius, but the moment when the story would become real, No longer prophecy, no longer possibility, only performance. To this day, the custodes do not discuss Saturnine in tactical review. Their records stop precisely 1 hour before the collapse of the wall, because even they cannot account for what happened, even they cannot describe the door that opened, only that it did, and that Valdor walked through it, without his spear, without his war plate, without looking back, and with a mask in his hand, smiling. In the black arteries of the webway, where even light refuses to linger, there are places the Eldar fear to tread, not because of demons, those can be danced around, baited, and banished, not because of the Mon Ki, whose crude minds stumble in such impossible spaces. No, what the Eldari fear are the theaters left behind, not ruins, not traps, stages, places where curtains hang without motion, where aisles lead nowhere and every stone echoes footsteps that were never made, where sound behaves like a memory, and memory performs itself again and again until meaning unravels. These places are not marked on any craft world chart. Not even the Harlequins know them all. But there is one mask, the Shattered Veil, that keeps a record, not of the places themselves, but of the performances that have occurred within them. They carry no data slates, no scrolls. Their records are worn in masks, each one engraved with the play they witnessed. And one mask is never worn, a full-face piece of shimmering yellow, cracked vertically from brow to chin. The eyes are blank. The smile is half-finished. No one knows who carved it. No one claims to have performed the tale it represents. Yet every solitaire of the Shattered Veil carries it, and none will speak of it. But there was one performance they did speak of, because it broke the cycle, because it was not written by Sigarak, because it was not part of the mask, because it was not theirs. It occurred in M35, in a forgotten branch of the Webway near the Ghoul Stars, where the Harlequins had been tracking a splinter of Slaaneshi corruption that had infected a Black Library outpost. The mask sent its elite, players who had reenacted the war in heaven 100 times, who had portrayed Iniad and Cain in the same breath. They expected demons. They expected madness. They found a stage, not ruined, not decayed, set, an amphitheater of obsidian and bone dust, carved into the walls of unreality itself. No door led in, no tunnel led out. And seated in the gallery were masks, hundreds, maybe thousands, suspended mid-air in rows, watching, each one different, each one turned toward the stage, waiting. At the center of the stage stood a single figure, not Eldar, not human, not anything the Harlequins recognized. He was tall, robed in layers of pale gold and parchment-colored silk. His mask was cracked, not from battle, but from rehearsal. He held no weapon. He stood as if he had always been there. And when the Harlequins entered, he bowed. Not as an actor, as a host. The Shadow Seer leading the troupe, Vidal Tesh, called the One Without Echo, stepped forward and began the opening jest, a sacred prelude meant to establish dominance in any psychic theater. Her illusions swirled around the stage, painting the air in color and memory. She spoke in 17 voices, danced in 3 bodies. The masked figure did not move. When she finished, the masks in the seats clapped. He did not. Instead, he raised one hand, and the Harlequins began to perform. Not willingly. They felt their limbs move, their voices sing, their feet fall into rhythm. Not controlled, not possessed, but directed, as if the script had already been written and they were simply catching up. They danced a tragedy none of them knew, a tale of a golden warrior who had once guarded a god, who had learned the god was a character, and had donned a mask to take over the performance. The tale was not an allegory. It was a biography. The figure in yellow watched in silence. And when the performance reached its end, the Harlequins collapsed, not dead, but spent. Their minds exhausted from channeling a story not theirs, a rhythm not written by their laughing god. Vidal Tesh crawled to her feet and asked one question. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward. He did not answer, he simply lifted his hand again and placed it on his chest. For a moment his mask shimmered, not removed, revealed, and beneath the illusion they saw him, the first, the shadow of terra. Valdor, but not Valdor as they had ever known him, not a custodian, not a warrior, a director, one who had stepped outside of his emperor's gaze, not in rebellion, but in compliance, one who had seen the threads of fate and refused to be bound by them, one who now wrote them. And as the masks in the theater vanished, one by one, he extended his hand to Vidal Tesh. In it, a single page, a script fragment, 7 lines, no title. The first line, "Enter, the audience." She took it, not because she wished to, because she already had. The mask of the Shattered Veil fled the webway stage that day, their dancers broken, their tale unfinished. When they returned to the Black Library, the Inari who reviewed their minds found that each bore the same scar, a memory that would not settle, like a song missing its final note. And in the archives they found a sealed record that had never been opened, filed under Constantine Valdor. Authorship unknown. The document was not in Eldar, it was in Low Gothic, a script, its title, The Crownless King. And beneath it, 3 words, "Rehearsal in progress." Since that day, Harlequins across the galaxy have reported sightings. A figure in yellow standing among the dead of Vigilis, a masked observer at the Battle of Raukos, where Guilliman nearly fell. A golden man in robes pacing the ruins of Comora after the demon invasions. Always watching, never interfering. Like a director at the edge of the theater, arms folded, making sure the actors hit their marks. The Eldari no longer call him by name. They call him the Crownless King, because he does not sit on a throne. He walks around it, and when he passes they bow, not in reverence, in acknowledgement that their gods, their tragedies, their sacred cycles are not the only ones being told, because Valdor was not lost. He was recast, and the curtain has yet to fall. It began with a break in the pattern. The Ordo Chronos is unlike its sister Ordos. It does not pursue heresy demons or Xenos. It pursues anomalies, events that should not happen, timelines that fracture, paradoxes that echo like thunder between the walls of reality. It keeps no temples, no public halls. Its agents do not wear purity seals. They carry chronoglaves etched with forgotten glyphs, and within them is the final truth. Time is not linear. It is performed. And in the year 1041.926, a performance was interrupted. Inquisitor Grendal Voss was one of the Ordo Chronos' most precise minds. Recruited from the Schola Progenium on Vanaheim, trained in the temporal tombs beneath Ophelia VII, Voss had unraveled 5 closed-time loops, averted the false birth of a second Saint Celestine, and disproven the existence of 3 alternate terrae. He knew time like a musician knows tempo, and something was off. It began on the planet Quinthar Delta, a barren mining world with no strategic value. A minor uprising had been predicted, catalogued, and logged for resolution by a local PDF detachment. Nothing remarkable, except the reports were wrong. Not just inaccurate, contradictory. 2 separate accounts, both sealed with verifiable inquisitorial rosettes, stated the event had already happened, twice. In both versions, the uprising ended in massacre, but the details were theatrical. One described the rebels as chanting in meter, as if reciting a script. Another claimed that the leader, a former serf named Hallex Grieve, delivered a monologue moments before dying. The wording was identical in both accounts, right down to the pause between phrases. Voss investigated. He found a third account encrypted in deep code on an Ordo Xenos transmission. It listed Hallex Grieve as a custodian. That was impossible. No custodian had set foot on Quinthar Delta in 10,000 years. They had no reason to, but the genetic match was exact, down to the micron-level identifiers encoded in the Emperor's gene craft. And then there was the line. Every report ended with it. A stage direction written in formal High Gothic. The curtain falls. Silence. Enter the King. Voss traced the anomaly backward, not through space, through time. Records of Valdor re-emerged in places he should never have been, not as a warrior, as a presence. In picked recordings recovered from the Rethan Null Time catastrophe, a figure matching Valdor's outline stands in the background, wearing a mask. Not golden, yellow, slightly cracked at the cheekbone. In one instance, a data feed from an Ordo Malleus cleansing operation showed a masked figure walking backwards through a scene, vanishing into a curtain of fire that did not burn. The Ordo Chronos grew concerned, then it grew afraid. Because Voss compiled all these fragments, every sighting, every distortion, every line of scripted dialogue that repeated across time, and they matched. The King in Yellow was not just moving through history, he was editing it, not by force, by cue. Voss presented his findings to the tri-chamber of the Ordo Chronos on Sigma Lacrim. 37 Inquisitors, some centuries old, gathered in a time-locked vault. He played the recordings. He showed the theater doors opening at Saturnine. The reports of a yellow-robed figure appearing at the fall of Cadia. The psychic echoes left in Guilliman's stasis pod, lines of a script scrawled across the inside of the stasis field in language older than Terra. He played the final recording, a vox capture from the vaults of the Scholastica Temporal, in which Valdor's voice, not an echo, not a simulation, his voice, spoke the following line: "You do not arrest a role, you retire it." And the room fell silent. Voss believed he was about to receive authorization. Instead, he was ordered to stand down. The tri-chamber voted in less than 10 seconds. They declared the investigation closed. Voss protested. He demanded they acknowledge the evidence. That's when the curtain fell. Not metaphorically, literally. A curtain of light, soft, golden, dust-flecked, descended over the chamber. Voss blinked, and suddenly the Inquisitors were performing. One stood and delivered a speech as if from a script, complete with dramatic pauses. Another wept on cue. A third applauded without knowing why. Voss stood frozen. Then he saw him, seated in the observation gallery, alone. Valdor, or what had once been Valdor. He wore no armor, just robes of antique yellow and a mask so smooth it seemed carved from solid silence. He said nothing, but Voss heard it, a single line, not spoken, projected. "You've reached the end of your part. The rest is mine." And then he was gone. The tri-chamber recovered. They remembered nothing. The security feeds were intact, but they showed an empty chamber and Voss ranting at shadows. He was arrested, declared unstable, mind-warped by chronal drift, sentenced to isolation in a null crypt on Golgotha Minor. But his notes survived, buried in the data shrines of the Ordo Chronos, deep within sub-layer 17 of the time-locked stacks, marked for deletion but never erased. And at the top of the file, in Voss's own hand, "The King is not changing the past, he's rehearsing the future." No Inquisitor since has dared to open the file, but sometimes during maintenance cycles it opens itself, and the screen displays a line. Act 4, lights up, audience seated. The Ordo Chronos does not speak of Valdor anymore, not because he frightens them, because they suspect they are no longer Inquisitors. They are characters, and they have already missed their cue. There is no courtroom in the Imperium, not in any traditional sense. Justice in the age of the Imperium is not weighed, it is imposed. Heresy is not tried, it is named, and naming is enough. But there was one moment lost in the folds of post-heresy silence, where judgment was passed not in the halls of the ecclesiarchy or the courts of the Inquisition, but in the black heart of the throne world itself, the trial of the hollow throne. It is not listed in the archives of the Administratum. No High Lord speaks of it. No custodian will answer questions about it. The trial was not public. It was not sanctioned. It was performed. And it was not the Emperor who presided. It was Valdor. The records that remain, flickering fragments of fractured data coils, describe the event as occurring within the catacombs of Solace, a chamber far beneath the Golden Throne, sealed with psychic chains older than the palace itself. A place used only once before, during the Unification Wars, to contain a creature that had once been a man, and then something else. It is said the catacombs can only be opened when a custodian speaks their name backward in the Emperor's voice, and someone did. The name of the chamber echoed across Terra's noosphere at exactly 3:33 a.m. on the 7th night of the 31st millennium. At that moment, the throne's pulse dropped, just for a second, but enough for the Astronomicon to flicker, enough for one astropath to see something behind the light. A mask watching from the other side. When the doors of the catacombs opened, there were 9 figures waiting. Not judges, witnesses. They included a Sister of Silence, once stationed at Luna's Vault of Echoes, who had not spoken in 300 years. A remembrancer from the War of Calth, who had been declared dead during the first bombardment, but was found alive in the crater of a collapsed theater. An Astartes librarian from the Death Spectres, whose mind had been blanked by an encounter with a temporal fracture. An inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, who had once accused the Emperor himself of false divinity and been allowed to live. 4 more, unnamed, whose identities were redacted from all records, even their DNA. And Valdor, not in golden armor, but in robes, yellow, pale but immaculate. He sat upon a throne that had never been recorded. It was not ornate, it was not mechanical. It was carved from simple obsidian, shaped like a director's chair, portable, impermanent, staged. No chains held the witnesses, no vox units recorded the words, but each one later claimed to remember the same series of events. The trial began with no formal accusations. Valdor simply asked a question. What is a throne without the one who speaks from it? No answer. The witnesses sat in silence. Then Valdor turned to each of them in turn. To the Sister of Silence, he said, "You kept your vow, and yet you still heard me." "Why?" She wept. To the librarian, "You saw the timelines break. Why did you let them return?" He replied, "I was waiting for someone to call cut." To the Inquisitor, "You accused the Emperor of deception. Were you wrong?" The Inquisitor smiled. "Number I just didn't realize who the playwright was." Then Valdor asked the last question. "Who will sit upon the throne when the final line is spoken?" No one answered, because the answer was already in the room. Not the Emperor, not a god, a director. The hollow throne was never meant to be filled by divinity. It was a placeholder, a symbol, a role. And when the Emperor fell, when the galaxy burned, when the Imperium twisted itself into a grim parody of what it had once sought to be, Valdor understood something no other being alive could comprehend. That the Emperor had played his part, and now another must continue the performance. So Valdor stood. He removed the mask, not to reveal his face, to change it. And each witness saw something different beneath it. The Sister of Silence saw her dead brother, smiling. The librarian saw a mirror version of himself, weeping ink. The Inquisitor saw a puppet cut from its strings, applauding silently. Each one saw the same truth, that the man beneath the mask was not Valdor anymore. He was the story itself, and he had no face because he had become the one thing the Emperor could never be: an audience. He saw it all, and in seeing, he remembered. He raised one hand, and a script unfolded in the air, pages of light and blood, swirling with lines not yet spoken. At the top of the first page, one phrase: Act 5, the ending begins. The witnesses stood, not because they were ordered, because they had rehearsed this moment their entire lives. The Inquisitor bowed. The librarian turned to Ash. The Sister of Silence smiled and finally spoke. You were always the throne. We just never knew how to sit. And then she vanished. The catacombs sealed again. They have never reopened, but in the archives of the Ordo Malleus, under vaults so deep they touch the crust of Terra, one line remains, etched into a data crystal set, to activate only when the Astronomicon fades for good. All trials are performances, and this one received a standing ovation. No one knows what Valdor did after the trial, but from that day forward, Custodes began finding scripts. Not orders, scripts, lines for battles not yet fought, deaths not yet experienced, sacrifices that had not been chosen but assigned. They did not disobey, because something in them recognized the story, and far beneath the golden throne where no light reaches, the hollow seat remains, not empty, waiting for the final cue. And the king, crowned in memory and shadow, watches the galaxy stumble toward its finale, smiling. They never speak of him. Not one of them. Not Fulgrim, not Mortarion, not Magnus, not even Lorgar. The mouth of gods, the self-declared prophet of chaos. Among the traitor Primarchs whose pride once rivaled the stars, whose madness bloomed into empires of lies, there exists a silence so heavy, so precise, that it can only be rehearsed. It is the silence that follows a performance so flawless, it leaves no applause behind. And it is always the same question, asked in dark corners of demon worlds and dying temples by warlocks and corrupted seers alike. What did the king say to them? Because he has spoken to them. That much is certain. They will not name him, but their nightmares do. Their relics avoid his colors, and when his mask appears in a dream, they wake shrieking, not from fear, but from recognition. They remember him, long before the fall, long before the heresy. They knew Valdor. The first to encounter him after the siege was Mortarion. It was not on a battlefield, not in the Gardens of Death or the Plague Moons. It was in a place that no one had stepped into in 10,000 years, Drekthar Hold, one of the original fortresses built during the Unification Wars, buried beneath the crust of Terra, untouched by the surface fires of the heresy. Mortarion found it by accident, or by plan. Even he didn't know which. The Death Lord entered the hold expecting ghosts, echoes, perhaps remnants of imperial dogma to poison and mock. What he found instead was a stage, wooden, carved, still smelling of oil and silence. At the center stood a figure in yellow, seated in a director's chair, back turned. Mortarion raised silence and froze, because the voice that answered him was his own. "You're early. You don't die until Act 6, Mortarion charged. The figure vanished. When he awoke, days or centuries later, he found the word intermission etched into his chest in lacerations that never healed. He has never spoken of it, but his sons whisper of the nightmares that followed, of Mortarion pacing endlessly in his citadel, rehearsing arguments aloud, delivering monologues to no one, searching for someone who always entered just after the scene had ended. Then there was Magnus, the Red King who sees all, or thought he did. During one of his deep warp meditations, Magnus traveled too far, reaching what scholars of the esoteric refer to as the Vaults of Echoes, a region of the Imperium not mapped by any demon, god, or prophet, a place that only reflects what you bring into it. Magnus entered expecting mirrors. Instead, he found curtains, hanging in infinite rows layered in velvet and gold, and at their center a spotlight with no source, and beneath it, Valdor, or rather, a script that looked like Valdor. He stood facing away, muttering lines. "You are blind in 7 languages. You never killed Ahriman. That was the tragedy. You were always reading the wrong book." Magnus tried to speak, to command, to rewrite. He couldn't. The warp wouldn't obey him. The theater had rewritten the laws. And then Valdor turned, not in accusation, in applause. The sound thundered across the echoing void, not from Valdor, from every version of Magnus who had ever existed, watching, clapping, drowning him. Magnus awoke screaming. Since then, the changeling, Tzeentch's jester, has refused to enter his sanctum. Not out of fear, out of respect, because even madness knows when it has met a better actor. Then came Lorgar, the most dangerous of all, not because of his power, but because of his faith. Lorgar, who wrote the Lectitio Divinitatus. Lorgar, who broke his father's vision and replaced it with a god's. He met the king in yellow on the ash-strewn plains of Sycharis during his self-imposed exile. The skies had gone quiet, the demons had fled, and in their place a page, just one. Lorgar picked it up. It read, "Scene, a prophet meets the man he thought was a soldier." Valdor stood behind him, not masked, not robed, just standing. Lorgar fell to his knees, not in reverence, in fury. "You knew," he said. "You saw all of it." "I read it," Valdor replied. "Why didn't you stop it?" "Because the audience needed to see it." "You let the galaxy burn." "No," said Valdor, and his voice was soft. "I let it perform." And then he handed Lorgar a new page, a blank one. Lorgar took it. He has not spoken since. The last record of him was not a sermon, it was a script. And Fulgrim, even Fulgrim refused to watch the king perform. But he saw him once, at a masquerade held in the impossible gardens of the Palace of Sins, a celebration held by Slanesh to mark the fall of the Phoenix Worlds. Fulgrim was guest of honor. The king was not invited, but he appeared nonetheless. A simple figure, in yellow, wearing a mask with no features, only a faint trace of a grin. Fulgrim approached, swirling in silks and perfumes, demanding to know who dared to mimic perfection. Valdor said nothing, but all the dancers froze. All the music ceased. The ballroom became a stage, and Fulgrim, only Fulgrim, was left in the spotlight, naked, unadorned, unloved. And in that moment, for just 1 second, the demon Primarch remembered what it was to be human. He fled. He has never danced again, not without looking over his shoulder. None of them speak of the king. But they all see him, on the edge of every battle, at the corners of every ritual, in the shadows of every cathedral they build in mockery of truth. They see the yellow mask watching, not judging, not condemning, only witnessing, like a playwright whose script has taken on a life of its own. They fear the king in yellow, not because he is powerful, but because he already knows their lines, because he never interrupts, he only lets them finish. And when they do, he turns the page, because to him they were never villains, they were never heroes, they were roles, played to perfection, and forgotten the moment the curtain fell, just as he planned. The 13th Black Crusade was a storm of legends, the fall of Cadia, the tearing of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the resurrection of Robute Gaiamin, the first true convergence of traitor and loyalist since the fires of the Horus heresy. It was a war of gods and demigods, of reality bent and screaming across the stars, and yet amid that inferno, in the blood and scripture of dying worlds, something older moved, something quieter. It did not command armies, it did not raise banners, it did not shout from the Vox or lead charges into the jaws of chaos. It watched. Theater. That is the only word left in the wake of its passing. Not battlefield, not massacre, theater. For what else could it be when even Abaddon, the despoiler, felt like a puppet tugged by unseen threads? When the planets fell in precise cadence, each sacrifice marked and delivered like lines in a play. When Guilliman awoke not with freedom, but with purpose, speaking words he had never studied, quoting passages not written in any imperial creed. Because he had a script, too, and the one who had written it stood unseen in the wings, arms folded, yellow mask gleaming with dust. Constantine Valdor, the king in yellow. It began on Cadia, though not in the firestorms or among the shattered pylons. It began beneath, deep in the hollow crust where the Mechanicus stored forbidden fragments of the Necron inertial dampeners, surrounded by wards, guarded by loyalist Skitarii, whose data records would later self-corrupt upon mention of a single anomalous figure. That figure was not Abaddon. It was not Trazyn, despite his own quiet meddling. It was a man, robed, silent. He walked into the vault, untouched by machine or flame, and simply gestured to the ancient black stone slab at the heart of the chamber. A voice emerged from nowhere, mechanically distorted. Not machine, not warp. "Do you remember your line?" The Mechanicus scribes replied in binary. The answer was yes. The slab fractured, not by force, by direction. And as the ground above began to collapse, as the eye of terror bled into the physical realm and the final battle began, Valdor turned and walked through a door that should not have been there. A stage door, painted black, inscribed with the sigil of the Terran Scriptoria, closed behind him. The first scene was complete. As Abaddon's legions poured through the breach, as demons howled and the Cadian gate began to fail, an astropath stationed aboard the Veritas, Eterna, received a transmission from an impossible source. It was not encrypted, not encoded. It was a monologue, 6 minutes long, recited in perfect high Gothic. It detailed the destruction of Cadia, the collapse of the pylons, the shattering of the gate. 2 hours before it happened. The astropath survived just long enough to whisper the final line to her captain. The curtain falls on Cadia. Then her heart stopped, her eyes burned yellow. The recording was erased, but not before a surviving cogitator, hidden among the ship's theater relics, archived one entry under the heading, Act 4, The Fall of the Unbreakable World. On Luna, as Guilliman's rebirth approached, the Adeptus Custodes began reporting anomalies. Not in the warp, in behavior. They found themselves quoting doctrine that didn't exist, repeating orders they had not been given, saluting when no one entered. In the Hall of Echoes, a custodian discovered a folded piece of parchment on his bunk. It was addressed to the audience. He opened it. It contained only a single sentence. When the sun awakens, he must speak with certainty. Remind him of the light. That same day, Robute Guilliman opened his eyes and said aloud, "There is still a spark of hope, a single light in the darkness. That must be enough." No one knows who wrote those words. Guilliman had never spoken them before, but he delivered them like a practiced line, like a rehearsal. And from the shadows of the Primarch's chamber, something unseen nodded, not approvingly, correctively, as a director does when the scene finally plays as written. Then came the Battle of Lion's Gate, the first time the rift bled into real space above Terra. The first time the ecclesiarchy trembled not at a god's voice, but at a script. Because as the cults screamed and the sky burned, hundreds of sermons were interrupted by a single phenomenon. A line, the same everywhere, etched in blood, painted in fire, whispered in vox static, written across the eyelids of those who had been dead for centuries. The king enters from stage left. At first they thought it a joke, a cult trick, a demonic misdirection, until a custodian vanished in the middle of prayer, until the high canoness of the Order of the Azure Rose began reciting her own death speech 3 days before she died, word for word, tone for tone, until a child in the depths of the hive lifted his head and asked his mother, "Who wears the mask today?" No one had spoken those words aloud, not in 10,000 years, not since Valdor disappeared. But the performance had begun, and none of them could look away. Then came the final scene, not in a city, in a theater. The Nova Obscura, a ruined opera hall on the agri-world of Bellatros, long abandoned. The battle for the system had ended. Chaos had been routed. Guilliman's forces prepared for consolidation, but the Nova Obscura lit up. No power source, no attendance, just light, and within a figure in yellow performed before an audience of no one alive, only masks, thousands of them, floating, watching. Valdor stood alone on the stage and spoke not to them, but to us, the galaxy, the audience. You have watched war and called it faith. You have watched death and called it loyalty. You have watched the Emperor die and still chant his name. So tell me, what would you not believe if I told you it had already been written? He turned to the empty seats. The 13th Crusade ends not in death, not in victory, not in change. It ends in applause. And across the stars, at that exact moment, 23 worlds heard it. Clapping, no source, no explanation, just slow, deliberate applause. And then silence. Guilliman does not speak of it. Abaddon cannot. The Black Crusade ended, but the war did not. Because Valdor was not fighting, he was directing. And the 13th Black Crusade, it was not a victory, it was not a defeat, it was a scene, one act in a far greater performance. And the king in yellow, he didn't win, he didn't need to, because the audience stayed in their seats, because no one left the theater, because they are still watching, and the curtain has yet to fall. There are words so powerful they don't echo across the galaxy, they reverberate backwards through time. Words that scar the past, that stain memory with meanings it never carried before. One of those words is rubric. To the common man of the Imperium, the rubric of Magnus is little more than an esoteric horror, a sorceress spell gone wrong, a punishment or a purge, depending on which historian you believe. A single act of psychic desperation that transformed thousands of thousand suns into dust-filled automatons, bodies encased in armor, minds erased, souls fused into silence. But that is the version taught to imperial scholars. The Inquisition, even in its most arcane divisions, understands only a fraction more. The rubric was not just a spell, it was an edit, a revision of existence by a Primarch too proud to accept what fate had written for him. And yet, there is a version of the rubric that was never recorded. A prelude to that moment, sealed in the ancient vaults of the Scholastia Sicana and buried in myth. A whisper among the Ordo Chronos. A legend among the black priests of Gethsemane. They call it the Yellow Revision. And it begins not with Magnus, but with Valdor. Long before the rubric was cast, before Magnus shattered himself across the Empyrean, before Prospero burned, Valdor visited the Thousand Suns. It was a quiet mission. No proclamation, no war host, no fanfare. Just Valdor and 5 other custodians aboard a ship with no name, descending through the ion-choked skies of Prospero like a silent blade. Magnus welcomed him personally. They had known each other once, not as brothers, not as friends, but as instruments forged by the same mind. Magnus, the Cyclopean sorcerer, and Valdor, the Emperor's shadow, both designed for comprehension but in opposing languages. They met in the Corvidae Sanctum, a chamber wrapped in crystal spires and shimmering mind light. It was here Magnus charted the paths of possible futures, constellations of might-be and might-not woven like constellations into the walls. Valdor said nothing for 17 minutes. Then he spoke. "You're rewriting." Magnus didn't deny it. "I am repairing." "You're changing the lines." "I'm correcting the author." "He is the author." "Then the author made mistakes." Silence. And then Valdor did something no one, not even Magnus, expected. He handed him a script. Not written, not typed, projected. A living strand of narrative folded into psychic resonance. Magnus took it with care. He read it in seconds. He stopped breathing. What he saw was his own rubric, centuries before he would cast it. Line for line, word for word, including his final scream. "Where did you find this?" Valdor answered, "I didn't. I wrote it. For you." It was not a warning. It was a direction. Magnus screamed. Fire erupted across the sanctum. Demonic echoes howled from the walls. The warp twisted, and for one brief second, Prospero was no longer a planet. It was a theater, and every psyker on its surface was performing a scene they had not realized they had already rehearsed. Valdor did not move. "This isn't prophecy," Magnus spat. "This is control. It is rehearsal. You would make me a puppet. You made yourself one when you opened the eye." Magnus shattered the projection, burned it in thought, but it did not disappear. It rewound, and Valdor recited the first line aloud. Magnus struck him, a blow of psychic wrath that would have sundered a night titan. But it passed through Valdor like smoke, because he was not standing there. He was behind the scene, a director in the wings. That encounter was forgotten, or made to be. The Thousand Sons never spoke of it. The Custodes denied it happened, but when the rubric was cast, when Ahriman unleashed the spell that calcified his brothers into statues of soul steel, a single anomaly appeared in the warp echo. A name. Valdor. He was not present, and yet every psyker who witnessed the rubric, imperial, traitor, or demon, saw a flash of yellow silk just before the ritual collapsed. Some claim Ahriman hesitated in that moment, that he blinked, that he almost dropped the spell, because someone else was reading his lines. The rubric worked and failed. It bound the Thousand Sons. It saved them from mutation. But it stole their voices, not as punishment, as direction, a tragic act, final and silent, and written long ago by the only man who had ever watched the whole war before it began. After the rubric, Valdor appeared again, not to Ahriman, to a rubricae. It was on the demon world of Urus 9, where a band of word-bearers attempted to unlock the secrets of rubric armor through sorcerous vivisection. One of the rubricae was being dissected. Its armor opened like a coffin. The sorcerer reached into its core and found a script etched into the inner wall of the chest cavity. 7 words. "You were always meant to forget," he screamed. His body evaporated into ink, and behind him, a tall figure in yellow watched from the shadows. The rubricae turned its head toward him, and bowed. No soul, no voice, but the movement was rehearsed. The king in yellow reached out, touched its helm, and the rubricae spoke. Just once. "Thank you." To this day, Ahriman hunts the remnants of the rubric. Not to reverse it, to understand it, because he now suspects something far worse than error. He suspects the rubric was not a failure, but a script change, that his great act of desperation was not his own invention, that it had been handed to him, not by the gods, not by fate, by Valdor, the master of the unspoken stage, the first custodian who became not protector, but playwright. Somewhere in the Cyclopean wastes there exists a monument, invisible. You only see it when you realize what scene you're playing in. It is a throne, broken in two. Upon it rests no name, only a line. He who rewrites must never be seen. And below it a mask, not golden, yellow, waiting for the next revision. It began, as so many things do in the Imperium, with a lie. Terra was never silent. The throne world's surface buzzes with endless movement, millions of pilgrims groveling through dust, vox towers shrieking sermons across districts so vast they blur geography, and the Adeptus Administratum grinding time itself to dust beneath the weight of its parchment. And yet, on the day of the fold, every choir in the Sanctum district fell quiet. Not together, in sequence. A descending silence, as if someone was walking through the city, and with every step the voices ceased, not in fear, not in reverence, but as if cueing an end they didn't know they were rehearsing for. They called it a phenomenon. They called it a solar irregularity, a vox cycle fault, a stochastic psionic rhythm. But the astropaths knew better. They felt it. The hum of presence, not demonic, not divine, something beneath all of that, something older than the imperial creed, something that wore no title, bore no allegiance, and yet stood at the center of every lie the Imperium had ever told itself. Constantine Valdor was coming home. No ship carried him, no signature crossed orbital logs, no Geller field flickered, no teleportarium burned. He simply was. One moment, the gate of echoes, long sealed and forgotten behind the votive spires of the custodes' barracks, was empty, and then it opened, not with force, with grace, like a curtain parting. Two custodians, stationed for ceremonial honor, stood in place. Their retinal augments glitched for less than a second. When their sight returned, he stood before them. Robes of parchment gold, a mask with no mouth, no weapon, just a scroll held in both hands. They did not salute. They did not move. They could not from paralysis, from memory. Every part of them remembered Valdor, not just in duty, in identity. He had been there first, the shape that every blade of their discipline had been carved against, and here he was, changed, but undeniably him. One custodian whispered the only words he could form. "Is this your return?" Valdor tilted his head, spoke nothing, handed the scroll to the custodian. It read, Scene 1, The Emperor's Silence. He did not ascend the stairs of the imperial palace. He did not walk the thoroughfares or greet the high lords. He moved through corridors that should not exist, through backstages of the palace that had been sealed since the old night. He passed data shrines that still whispered in binary tongues no tech priest had spoken in millennia. He stood before the arch of memory and did not bow. He walked through it. That arch had not been used since the Unification Wars, yet it opened for him. Beyond it, a chamber lost to even the custodians, an antechamber beneath the throne, where the Emperor's psychic imprint had once been stored in crystalline filaments. A rehearsal room for divinity. There, waiting for him, were three figures. Not men, not demons, roles, the voice, the warden, the echo, representatives of the Ordo Chronos, the Librarius Unspoken, and the remaining silent choir. They knew who he was. They had dreamed of him. They had tried to forget. They bowed, not in deference, in agreement. He asked no questions. He spoke no commands. He only handed them each a page, 3 scripts, one titled The End of the High Lords, one titled The Second Birth of Silence, one titled The Last Custodian. None of them were dated. All of them were final acts. Outside, the people of Terra began seeing masks, first in the dust, then in the smoke from incense, then in their dreams. Every mask was yellow, expressionless, watching. And some said when they awoke, they remembered their own lives differently, as if the last few years had been lines, recited in a play they had only just realized was being performed. One lowly scribe remembered writing the same document every day for 9 years, until, one morning, he looked down and saw the page blank, save for the line, "Your scene has ended. Thank you for your service." He disappeared that day. No record of him remains, only the parchment, now stored in the forbidden folios beneath the Hall of Pronouncements. Then came the audience. The chamber beneath the throne lit for the first time in 10,000 years. Not with light, with attention, custodians, cardinals, inquisitors, silent sisters, lords militant. Each was summoned by name, not by voice, but by script. Letters appeared on their desks, folded in yellow, marked only with a single sigil, a mask drawn in a single line. They came, not because they were ordered, because they knew they already had. They entered the chamber in silence, took their seats. Valdor walked onto the stage. There was no curtain, there was no introduction, only the mask and the scroll. He opened it, spoke the first line. Once, there was an emperor, and he believed in truth. The audience did not react, because they knew the next line. But truth was too loud, so he asked for silence. Valdor paused, took off the mask. No face beneath. Only us. He gestured to the crowd. And now, the audience must speak. He walked into the center of the room, knelt, and said nothing more. The trial did not happen. The judgment was not passed, because it had already been written. Valdor had not returned to reclaim his title. He had not come back to serve. He had come back to deliver the final line, to end the scene. Because the king in yellow is not a villain, not a savior. He is the one who knows when the scene must change. And on that day, beneath the throne, Terra itself shifted. Not in politics, not in power, in tone. A chapter closed, and the next was already on the page. In the records of the silent choir, there is now a final file. It cannot be deleted. It plays without sound. A single visual, Valdor, facing the audience, mask in hand, and beneath it the words, "End of Act 5. Lights fade. The audience remains. He has returned. Not to rule, to exit, because the story is almost over, and the curtain is very, very near. There is no record of his footsteps. No cogitator recorded the pressure of his heels upon the marble floors of the silent gate. No servo skull tracked his presence. No gene lock confirmed the man who walked the length of the inner sanctum was Constantine Valdor. But the 10,000 knew. They felt it. Not as sound, but as absence, a gravity in the air that pulled at their oaths, their long-forgotten dreams, the bedrock of identity they had spent millennia reinforcing like golden armor. He had returned, but not as one of them, as the one who had left them behind. Valdor did not call a council. He did not summon the shield captains. He simply walked into the Hall of the Watchers, beneath the statues of the first custodians ever forged, beneath murals of loyalty and vigilance, and placed an object at the foot of the central plinth. A mask, cracked down the center, painted in flaked yellow, as if worn through time instead of pigment. The custodians present, dozens of them, each with centuries of service, veterans of the Webway breach and the age of apostasy alike, stood motionless. None reached for a weapon. None made a sound. They all recognized the mask. Every single one had seen it once before, not with their eyes, but in their training dreams, the psychic lattice tests conducted during their forging. That shape, that color, that emptiness had been injected into their minds before they ever stood upon Terra's soil. None of them understood it then. They did now. Valdor stepped away from the mask and waited. No speech, no proclamation, only expectation. The first to speak was Anton Valerus, shield captain of the Solar Phalanx. He had served unbroken for 4,000 years, his mind sharpened to such precision that his every word was considered a weapon. You do not belong here anymore. Valdor tilted his head, not in denial, in agreement. Another spoke, Sotia Marrakes, once dubbed the Silent Ember. She had never raised her voice in living memory. She raised it now. Why come back? Valdor stepped forward and placed his hand on the base of the plinth. It hummed. The murals shifted. They did not change in paint, they rearranged. Scenes from the siege of Terra. But different. Not battles. Stages. Every remembered war became a set. Every pose a performance. The blood games, dress rehearsals, the defense of the Emperor, an act of silent theater. Even the oath of the 10,000 carved in adamantium across the dome. We stand so he may endure, rewrote itself. We perform so he may exit. The custodians recoiled, some raised blades, others knelt, unbidden. Because it was true, they had always known it. Their perfection, their infallibility, their immortality, it had all been staged, built to support a god who had never asked to be one, who had written a final act and vanished behind the curtain of divinity because no one else knew the script, no one except Valdor. He turned to them at last, and spoke the first words he had uttered in millennia. I am not your Captain General. I am not your brother. I am your closing line. Chaos had not broken them. The death of the Emperor had not shaken them. The rise and fall of high lords, the psychic screams of the galaxy, the cicatrix maledictum, none of it had breached the golden wall of their conviction. But this did. Because Valdor had not returned to lead them, he had returned to relieve them. He reached into his robe, withdrew a scroll, unfurled it across the floor. The script was not long, just one page, but every custodian saw his name upon it. Not once, twice. Once where he entered, and once where he exited. Valdor had written their ends, not in blood, in stage direction. Shield Captain Valerus lunged, his blade striking faster than mortal thought. It stopped an inch from Valdor's throat. Not because Valdor moved, but because Valerus read the next line. He does not kill him, he kneels instead. His body obeyed. Tears fell, something no custodian had experienced since their forging. Not because he was sad, but because he remembered the rehearsal. The hall fell to silence, and Valdor walked the length of it once more. He touched each statue, spoke a name beneath his breath. Names no custodian had ever known. Their true names, not battle honors, not ranks, but the names they had before they were recast into perfection. Each one responded as if waking from a dream. One fell, one screamed, one laughed and wept and saluted all at once. Each found in that moment the memory of who they had been, and who they were written to be. The last custodian wasn't Valdor. It was each of them, realizing they were not warriors anymore. They were characters in their final act. He left the hall, not escorted, not followed, just watched, as the mask remained on the plinth, its crack gleaming in the gold light, and beside it a second object, a director's chair, folded, unused, labeled with a plaque, Constantine Valdor. Roll, closure. Since that day, the custodians have changed. They no longer stand guard in ceremonial ranks. They walk Terra's streets. They sit in the Senate and say nothing, their silence heavier than law. They patrol the archives not to defend them, but to edit them. One carries a scroll in his chest plate, another bears a mask within his war plate. They do not say why. They do not need to. because their performance is ending, the stage is being cleared, and only one scene remains. Valdor walks terra still, unseen, not because he hides, but because he is done being watched. He has handed off the script. The curtain has begun to lower, and when the final line is spoken, when the last custodian bows, there will be silence. But not an ending. Just the dark before the lights rise, and the next play begins. There is a room in the Imperial Palace that has no doors, no schemata mention it, no custodian patrol passes through it, no servo skull scans it. Yet every one of them, every warrior, every priest, every scribe who walks the blackstone veins of terra knows it exists. They call it the Velvet Vault. The stories say that if you reach it, you're already inside, that it doesn't reside within the palace, but in the breath between heartbeats, the blink between centuries, a place outside of the story, where all lines have been said and the lights have already dimmed. And on the eve of the new millennium, as the cicatrix maledictum carved the galaxy in two, the vault opened. There were no alarms, no banners, just a faint shimmer, like heat off stone, and the whisper of cloth being drawn back. A curtain. Inside the vault there was no throne, no banners, no relics, only a single stage, wooden, black, empty. The floor bore no symbols, the walls were bare. There was no lighting but a soft golden haze, like memory made visible, and at the center stood him, Constantine Valdor, the king in yellow. But he no longer wore the mask, he held it in his hand, and behind him, seated in rows of ghost-light pews, were figures, not people, roles. Robout Guillemin, face unreadable, staring into a script not of his own making. Ahriman, fingers twitching, trying to write over his own scene. Celestine, wings folded, eyes brimming with a grief that had no name. Even Abaddon, hulking and furious, tethered to a chain of expectation thicker than the talon of Horus. And among them, you, the audience, the ones who prayed, the ones who obeyed, the ones who killed and bled and believed in the fiction so deeply it had become real. Valdor looked at all of you, and smiled, not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with a kind of exhausted relief. He stepped forward and began to speak. You thought this was a war. You thought this was a story of heroes and monsters, of loyalty and treachery, of gods and men. It wasn't. It was a play, and every one of you had your part. He turned to Guilliman. You were the reluctant son, the voice of reason, the echo of a dream that should have died. To Ahriman, you were the tragic scholar. You mistook knowledge for authorship, but you never wrote a word. To Abaddon, you were the antagonist, but never the villain. Not truly. You were the necessary shadow to cast the light. He gestured across the vault. And me? He raised the mask. I was the understudy. The one who steps in when the lead forgets his lines. The one who keeps the show moving when the crowd turns restless. I wore gold not to protect him, but to prepare you for when he stopped performing. He looked up. The golden haze flickered, and for the first time everyone in the vault saw it. The Emperor, not enthroned, not divine, watching. No longer a god, just a man behind the curtain. Eyes open, mouth closed, because he had spoken his last line 10,000 years ago, and Valdor had taken over, not to deceive, but to finish the scene. The Imperium is not a kingdom. It is a theater, and the longer you refuse to see the stage, the longer the show must go on. You worship the corpse of a god not because he lives, but because you're afraid to leave your seat. You still believe the next act will redeem you. He walked down the stage steps now, closer, so close his mask reflected you. But there is no next act. There never was. The lights are fading. The audience is asleep, and the players have all died waiting for their final applause. He raised the mask one last time. So I give you your ending. Not with war, not with fire. With silence. The vault dimmed, the stage went dark, and when the lights returned, he was gone. The mask remained, placed neatly on the center of the stage, cracked, still, waiting. Above it, inscribed into the ceiling, words not carved but remembered. The Emperor has exited. The King has bowed. The play is over. And across the galaxy something shifted. Not a sound. A relief. In the warp, demons screamed not in pain but confusion, as if a hand had turned the page and found no more text. On Terra, a custodian wept and dropped his spear, whispering, "No more lines." On Cadia's ruins, a dying heretic looked up and saw nothing, no light, no vision, just a curtain drawing closed in the void of his mind. And somewhere, in a cathedral with no doors, a child looked up at a statue of the Emperor and said, "I liked the story, but I don't need it anymore. The Imperium will go on, because it must, because plays continue even when the actors are gone. But those who heard the final words, those who saw the vault, they will remember, they will know that Constantine Valdor was never a traitor, never a hero. He was the final line, the last direction, the exit cue. And now, with the curtain fallen, the galaxy waits. Not for salvation, not for hope, just for the silence, the stillness after the applause, and the understanding that, in the end, the greatest lie of the Imperium was that it needed a god. All it ever needed was an ending, and now it has one.